Welcome back to My Trauma's Chronic, but I'm a chronic, where we delve deep into the transformative world of neurodiversity, coaching, and inclusive practices. I'm thrilled to be your host today as we explore fascinating insights and stories that empower and inspire. In this episode, we have a special focus on the evolving landscape of neurodiversity and its profound impact on coaching strategies and societal inclusion. Whether you're new to the topic or a seasoned advocate, you're in for a thought-provoking discussion filled with practice advice and personal narratives. Get ready to hear from Beth Thomas, who's a championing diversity advocate and pushing boundaries in the field of ADHD coaching and beyond. We'll uncover success stories, innovative approaches, and the latest research shaping our understanding of neurodiversity today. So, make sure to grab a cup of tea, get cozy, and let's dive into this enriching conversation together. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you valuable insights and making a meaningful impact on the world. How was your weekend?
My weekend. My weekend was nice. I had to go to London to go and see a friend. And it's always a conundrum because I'm a very country person. I do all of my work from home, so my life is very, very small in lots of ways, but I like it like that. So it's always a bit of a sort of interesting conflict to navigate sensory overload and all of the fun things that come with, different environments in order to do the things that also still mean a lot to me, like seeing a friend. So yeah, it was lovely, and also the other things as well. So I had a really nice quiet day yesterday, which was much needed.
Oh, that's good. It's good to see a friend. It's always like so like not strange, but it's like so like interesting to
Mhm.
see how like autism affect or like ADHD affects people who are in city or outside of a city.
Yeah.
Because if it's like I've noticed, even when I'm talking with other people, like who have neurodivergence, who are inside the city, when it comes to like walking in a very like busy, overwhelming street, they can do it. It's like go, 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 go. I guess
Yeah.
that's a very London like brain tap, or whereas people who are used to or like are born and raised or live outside of like London or any sort of cities, they find it way more overwhelming. Whereas
Yeah.
they might have the same sensory sensitivities to crowds and stuff. It's crazy.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. That was literally what happened at the weekend. So, like, my friend lives in London, very city person. So, at one point, turned around and said, "You're in London at the moment, so you don't need to apologize every time you bump into someone, and you don't like you." And so there's me, kind of, with my country perspective of, "Oh, sorry, oh God,
No,
how to
yeah,
navigate
you just go. That's what you do.
Yeah, and then having that kind of juxtaposition. So yeah, super super interesting. But yes, no, I feel much more at ease when I'm in, like, I don't know, a forest or a park or somewhere nice and quiet and much greener than a city for sure.
How would you describe your background? How would you describe yourself? But really, like, I feel like it's always like a difficult question. But if you could like describe yourself and what you do, what would you do? What would you do? What would you say? Sorry.
Well, great question, and such an open-ended one for a verbal processor. I love it. So I would say that I am a neurodivergent coach, consultant, educator, and advocate. So everything I do, often in both prefers professional and personal. There's a blend there. In both of those spheres, I am often. I'm not sure. I can only apologize if you can hear my nipple whining in the background. So I would say, probably gonna have to start this one again. But if I were to introduce myself, I would say I am a neurodivergent coach, consultant, educator, and really passionate advocate. So I support individuals and organizations on any of their potential challenges or things that they might like to explore, address, resolve, that are pretty much exclusively related to their neurodivergence. So that could be helping a client to uncover what neurodivergence means for them and how they would like to take that new understanding into a more inclusive lifestyle they'd like to build for themselves. And with an organization, that could be, how can we make this space more inclusive for people? What do we need to do to show up for and support individuals, regardless of their neurotype, in a much more inclusive fashion?
Mhm. I feel like it's like organizations don't realize it's a two-person work. It's not like, and I feel, and then they, no, like, I need to let my thought finish. It's like, and they forget that, an employer needs to put like some work in as well. It's not just about the employee. And then they wonder why their retention is so low.
Mhm. Absolutely, yes. I think one of the things I see a lot, and I think this stems from lots and lots of different things that could be at play here, but I often see a lot of the responsibility placed on the individual rather than a collaborative approach towards a better understanding and support all round. And it's never just the individual's responsibility to, let's say, figure out coping strategies or ways in which they can work better or more productive. And for those listening, I've kind of said those loosely in quotation marks because I struggle with a lot of that language myself. And it's, for me, about how can we develop this understanding? How can we improve this space or this
Mm.
approach so that it is more collaborative and more supportive and more inclusive rather than, oh, you're clearly the issue, so you need to go and fix that, because that is very deficit based, very pathology sort of paradigm based rather than how can we work together to
Hmm.
get what you need.
I think it's also like there was the one thing that frustrates me is like when people, especially when it's like sensory difficulties, or they're like, oh, put in your headphones, and you're like, I don't want to put my headphones on. And even if I did put my headphones off, it doesn't eliminate noise altogether. I don't go absolutely like hard of hearing or like deaf when I put these on, and then it's like a few moments of bliss.
Mm.
And I feel like that's often frustrating, or people think coping mechanisms are an instant fix. I'm like,
Mhm.
yeah, no, it's not like
Totally that linear.
sorry, come again.
Right, so if only it could be that linear, right? We often think of these things as being very sort of quick fix, oh, just easy to implement, that'll sort everything type of a
Yeah.
solution. It's often a lot more complex than that, understandably, because there's lots of different aspects that may or may not be, affecting our experience of that at any particular time.
It would be great if it was just an instant fix.
Right,
Love it.
exactly. Just buy a journal, get some sound cancelling headphones, and that's it. We're fixed.
What is ADHD even? Like that orbiting it. What inspired you to specialize in ADHD coaching and advocate for neurodiversity?
Oh, this is a good question. To be very honest and gonna say vulnerable as well, probably a lot about my own personal journey of not belonging, of not having those spaces in which I felt really seen and heard and valued for actually who I am as an authentic version of myself, and all of the associated challenges and at times traumas that I would often suffer as a result of that way of being. So for me, the inspiration comes from knowing how painful it can be to not have that in your life and to spend a lifetime trying to make sense of that as a result. And if I can use my lived experience together with the professional skills that I have been able to develop over the years to support other people to create those spaces and processes for themselves, that for me is absolute fulfillment. That is absolute. This is what I get out of bed for. And this is what gives me goosebumps, on a daily basis when I get to see a client or an organization transform And when they start really enjoying and celebrating that, that is one of the most wonderful things to be able to witness, and such a privilege as well. So yeah, that's what inspires me.
It's so, I feel like, especially people with autism and ADHD, we have such a justice, like sensitivity that, like, when things are like very, very difficult for us, we're like, oh
Mhm.
my God, we need to change it. We need to do something about it.
Mhm.
I don't know about you, but I like when I'm like, for example, if I'm getting my nails done or if I'm in education or whatever it may be, and it's something so difficult, I'm like there with a business plan in my head, like doing like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I would do. This is how it's going to be. And it's like, and I feel like it's so, like, I feel like certain experiences like provoke like these like thoughts and understanding, which helps us create such successful and very much needed services. But at the same time, it's quite upsetting that you need to go through those certain experiences or make your own like services or things for other people.
Mm,
Because
absolutely.
like, why does it not exist already? What do you think is the most common like misconception or stereotype about neurodivergent individuals?
Ooh, this is a great question. The most common misconception. Ooh, I want to say something around the very binary approach people tend to have when looking at it. And so for this, I would always say if you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. And I think one of the misconceptions that we often see create a lot of challenges and misunderstandings is that lack of awareness to see each and every person as a unique experience, a unique set of experiences, beliefs, challenges, strengths, all of these amazing things that come together to create a person, regardless of neurotype as well at this point. And I think one of those misconceptions that can be really challenging and painful is that kind of habit to sort of paint everyone with the same brush, if we were to use that analogy, and often overlook that really unique and individual aspect. So that goes on to create a lot of challenges with people's ability to engage and understand their own experience as being a unique one, particularly when it comes to things that we might think are very stereotypical, such as ADHD girls can't be hyperactive, or autistic individuals can't be social, or, all of these really harmful stereotypes that challenge a person's ability to engage with their own individual experience. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that I certainly see a lot and certainly frustrates me.
Yeah, it's that like I feel like it's like one of two ways. Is either people don't see that male versus female like autism, ADHD, or whatever neurodivergence um presents differently, but also they can have overlaps as well because like being like ADHD and female, they're more seen as inattentive than hyperactive. And also, people think hyperactive means bouncing off the walls, being like Tigger from Winnie the Pooh,
Mhm.
not like a hyperactivity on thoughts, and it just differs. I feel like people have such like very I don't know the word. They have one perception. Yeah, that's it.
Mhm.
One perception um of an idea,
Mhm.
and I guess that comes down to how society perceives things, or just like around like lack of awareness and education around it.
Mhm.
Like, what advice? I know we'll get into some like much more easier ones. What advice would you give someone who's considering ADHD coaching or seeking support for themselves or a loved one?
Mm. I think that's a really good question to ask. So, what I would first and foremost say, I think this is really important to clarify and highlight, particularly where we are currently in terms of so many conflicting understandings of what coaching is, as an example. As a coach, it's certainly not my job to be giving advice because it is absolutely the client's journey. So if someone came to me with that question of, what advice would you give? I would first be looking to spend some time really understanding that individual because, again, each individual is different. Just because I know a wealth of information about ADHD, I am a professionally trained coach, and I have a lived experience, does not then automatically mean I will have the correct advice to give a particular individual that I don't know. So before I could go about giving any advice, it would be to sit and understand what that individual is looking for. So it would be getting curious, and I would be looking at understanding that individual and what they would like to get from that journey in order to be able to potentially give some advice that might be helpful. And then that advice would be around getting curious, thinking about what they need from that space, what they need from that practitioner, things like lived experience. Is that important, not important for you? What types of qualifications are important to you? What area of specialty is important to you? So all of these different things will absolutely impact the type of coach or support that you search for, because you need to make sure that whatever it is you are seeking is able to meet your needs. I'm a great coach, but I'm not going to be everyone's ideal coach, and that's okay. So really thinking about those different factors that you need from a positive and productive experience is absolutely where I would start.
I feel like often, I feel like it's not even just experts, it's people with neurodivergence. Especially there's like posts online about someone sharing them or their loved one's experience. And it's usually a negative experience. Like the first example that's coming um, to my head is this girl with autism um, and other neurodivergence as well as schizophrenia. Um, no, I'm lying. Psychosis. Getting denied from going into Stormzy's new like house club thing because she was displaying a bit. She was a bit like dissociated, but not like distress. So it's just like a bit overwhelmed, trying to cope. And people are like, oh my God, why would you take someone with psychosis there? I have autism and I wouldn't go to think like that. I find it really overwhelming. And I'm like, oh my God, the way that I went, like, replying to nearly like every single comment, which was like that, being like, because you have autism or because you have like psychosis or whatever it is, every condition, whether it's like neurodivergence or not, whether it can be physical conditions as well. It's all a spectrum. It affects everybody differently. It affects everyone capacity differently. And because somebody has autism or neurodivergence or psychosis, which else, doesn't mean that they don't have capacity automatically.
Mhm.
And I feel like people often think that capacity automatically like the lack of capacity, I should say, comes automatically with all these diagnoses, but it really doesn't. And and I feel like people are I feel like, people who are not neurodivergent are so judgmental. And then to find people within the community of neurodivergence is a very upsetting and a very distressing experience because, like, why would, like, even though I may not understand, your struggles, doesn't mean that I can't just sit and listen and validate somebody's experience. And these people are not going online and sharing their experiences to seek advice. They just want to gain some sort of awareness to the situation. Anyway, kind of rant of the day. We're going to talk about navigating like sensory overload, because it presents as a profound challenge for many individuals across the neurodivergent spectrum. And, often sensory overload is seen as overstimulation of one or more senses, and it can significantly impact like cognitive processing, emotional well-being, and daily functioning, especially for neurodivergent individuals. Um, and sensory overload can be particularly intense and destructive. And um, understanding its complexities, it's going to be a very generic approach because it affects everybody like differently. Um, and we're going to explore the idea of like navigating sensory overload.
Mhm.
Like, I know like you can't be specific because it's really a person to person thing. But what are the primary factors that contribute to sensory overload for neurodivergent individuals, and how do these differ from neurotypical experiences?
Mm. So a lot to unpack there. So I would first and foremost start with saying that, as you've already recognized, it does impact everybody differently, and spending time to get curious about your individual sensory profile is really, really helpful because it will empower you with the awareness of exactly what is going to potentially trigger or exacerbate those difficulties with managing. And understanding that it is a unique experience will also be really helpful because it will help to open up the space to practicing some self-compassion. So, when we are considering a topic like this, once we have created the space in which to become curious about it, we can spend some time asking curious questions around what actually might be causing it. So, figuring out a person's level of awareness around their own sensory profile and what their environments and demands in any given day look like and how they might factor in to the management of sensory overload will be really, really important. I think it's very easy for us to overlook the intense nature that it can also have on our own experience of something. So if we think about just any sort of day-to-day expectation, we can see a lot of spaces that aren't particularly designed for neurodivergent people or indeed anybody with a different sensory profile. And these are in the sounds, the smells, the lights, the demands, the length of time, all of these various things that will play into a person's experience. We often see not a great amount of grace and compassion provided. So, for example, if I were to use a personal experience, I live and work from home because it enables me to adapt my environment to meeting my sensory needs in a much, much more effective way than working in an office space ever could. And that's really important to me, in able to show up to do my job really well and to hold space for other people to figure that out. And it took me a really long time to create that space in which I could get curious about the various things that impact me personally and then what I could do about it. I think a lot of the time people understandably want to rush into the sort of solutions aspect of something. But if we're not defining the understanding beforehand, those solutions may not really be addressing the core part of the challenge in the first place. So really getting curious about that, understanding it on an individual level, which gives us those really good solid foundations from which to build those strategies, I think is absolutely one of the key ways in which we can navigate this in a much more effective way, rather than a blanket, oh, well, can you get some sound cancelling headphones and have a hybrid working structure and maybe, I don't know, add a decompression strategy in at the end of the day. It's, yeah, as I say, it's very different for everybody. And really spending time to understand all of those different parts is absolutely where to start.
Can you explain the neurological mechanisms behind sensory overload and how they can manifest differently across various neurodivergence and what the similarities are? Again, it does differ person to person.
That is a really good question. So before I begin sharing my insights, I would have to really clarify that I'm not a neurological specialist. I'm not a sort of neuroscientist. So my understandings, perhaps for this, will be very inherently based in a lot of lived experience, and it might be worth double checking on a few of the insights because, again, I can't promise that they're going to be 100% aligned with research, which, by the way, we still need to do a lot more of, right? So it's an area that, even in a lot of medical ways, we still don't understand well enough. What I would potentially say that I seem to notice, and I would also say from a personal experience, is the way in which we interpret information and the way in which it's processed can often be quite significantly impacted by what we can sometimes understand to be an overactive amygdala. So we all have a different way in which we will perceive certain sensory input. All of that sensory input will be processed through to the brainstem, and it's first received by the amygdala. And the amygdala does a lot of really important things. And one of the things it does is to essentially act as a bit of a fire alarm system. And it essentially is the part of our brain that will determine what is and is not dangerous and all of the other various things. And so for those of you listening and watching on the video, I've got my hand up in a sort of little visual here. So if this were to be your brain stem and I'm sort of indicating my wrist, then the sensory input is going to go through all from our various areas through our brainstem up into the amygdala, which is tucked away underneath the rest of our lobes. So our brain looks like that. Now, if the amygdala decides that something is perhaps inherently dangerous, then it effectively disconnects our prefrontal cortex to enact our survival responses. And that is a really important process because that keeps us safe. Now, one of the only challenges in our current sort of day-to-day is that we might be potentially misperceiving the level of danger. Okay, so I'll use a personal example here. If I'm thinking about something that I have to do that might be particularly boring for me or quite challenging because it requires a lot of my, let's say, executive functioning capacity, I will find that particularly stressful, and sometimes that can trigger that response. Now, that is very different to running away from, let's say, a saber-toothed tiger, which, of course, back in the day would have been the appropriate response to have. In this one, it's admin, let's say. But I've still enacted the same mechanism because my brain has perceived it's dangerous, and therefore I need to keep myself safe and I need to get myself away from it. So that is one of the ways in which our brain can perceive, categorize, and determine something that may or may not be dangerous. Now, what that looks like on the outside is what is often termed as a disproportionate reaction to something, right? So we've overreacted to this situation that feels very mundane, or, what's your problem, or whatever language we might be very used to hearing. But for us in that moment, it's really real and it feels really intense and it feels really dangerous because that is how our brain has operated. So that is one of the ways in which our brain and systems can perceive something to be very different to perhaps what is actually at hand, although it does not make the situation within ourselves any less real or less valid. Now, when we start to factor in the additional senses, because we have that heightened sensory system, we're feeling that more intensely. So what might be a slightly uncomfortable jumper to, someone else that has a
Oh,
relatively
times.
low
Sorry.
profile, right? It feels, like the worst, most scratchy, uncomfortable, distressing, sort of texture in the world. And because of these differences in the ways in which we're perceiving, storing, and understanding that information, we will have different reactions and responses to it. And understanding a lot of that and unpacking it and what this means for each and every one of us will help us to understand what we need to navigate that moving forwards. I hope that helps to break a little bit of that down. But
No,
again,
it was way more than helpful. It was perfect.
okay.
It,
Brilliant.
it's so, you know what? It's so, like, a recent experience that I've had is I had to go to A&E, very, very stressful period. It's very loud, it's very bright, it's very loud, it's bright, there's something else I'm missing, and it's very busy. I think that's
Clinical.
yeah. Usually I would get like a room, like to the side, the closed door, where I can control the additional stimuli to some extent. But the even though these paramedics were aware of my neurodivergence, they decided to put me in wait. It wasn't a wait. Let's a makeshift waiting room, I guess. Um, when you go in like from an ambulance and it's the ambulance route, and so you're just sitting on a like it's not a corridor. Yeah, I guess it's a corridor. It's a corridor of some sort, with lots of people walking in and past, and it's like very, very overstimulating. And I feel like people often assume this is another thing I feel like we might be able to cover later, but assume that you don't have capacity because you're neurodivergent or you have carers or whatever maybe.
Mm.
And even when you communicate, is everything's like disregarded. But whereas if it was somebody else who did not have neurodivergence, or people cannot automatically tell there's something there. I can't tell what it is, but there's something there. They will treat you completely differently. Like you have capacity, like you're a human, like, you know. And I was like, what, this is too much. I know I'm in absolutely like crazy amounts of pain, but I need to leave because I'm going to end up getting really, really, really stressed. And the focus of this, like hospital visit, is going to change because that's what often happens. Um, and you communicate, and I feel like often, whether you verbally communicate or you communicate in many other ways, there is possible to communicate in it. And people don't take people with neurodivergence or disabilities seriously. And then that all builds up. And with the sensory sensitivity, I couldn't cope.
Mm.
There's a point to this. I promise there is a point to this. And I got really, really distressed. I decided to walk out, got really distressed, got to a point where I needed to get restraint. It's like there's so many things that can happen so quickly just because like something is seen as a simple accommodation or like an unnecessary accommodation is not met. It can ever really escalate. And for somebody else, it'll be like, you're aggressive, you're like this, you're like that. And you're like, this is this is as best as I could handle it. And if you listen to me, it's not a threat when somebody says this, but if you listen to me when I was communicating as best as I could and verbally, I would be able to like cope much better.
Mhm.
And I feel like these sensory sensitivities are seen as, oh, put it on your headphones, put on your sunglasses. Yeah, I want to put on my headphones and sunglasses, but it's not going to fix the issue. It might lessen the severity, but the severity is still very intense and very high. And
Absolutely.
it's like, and I feel like it's sensory sensitivity impacts, your cognitive functioning, your emotional regulation, and your social interactions.
Mm.
And yeah, and people need to realize that it's not just something that's, oh, it's a bit painful. It has a knock-on effect to everything. And I feel like it's very, very frustrating, especially when it's healthcare professionals, because neurodivergence, that training is not mandatory. Yeah, who was it? I think it was Matt Hancock who made it neurodiversity training mandatory in education. But it's like it's not mandatory everywhere, and I'm like, these things can be avoided. And for those who maybe, who may, whilst they're stressed, hurt people. It's like that could have been avoided if, you've had the right training, you've had the right thing. And a person, when they're distressed and they hurt someone, I mean, with their neurodivergence or mental health difficulties, they often don't have capacity in that moment, and they do not go willingly out their way to go hurt someone. Is a build up which could have been managed. And I feel like it's something that people need to realize about sensory overload. And the same can happen with like um when you're understimulated as well.
Mhm. Yep.
And
And
people see that, oh, being dramatic, being a bitch, being or whatever, and I'll be like, yeah.
You just hit on a really important, much wider discussion about lack of awareness and understanding, really underpinning a lot of these examples of escalation, which again end up being very victim blamey, which perpetuates the situation and redirects the responsibility back onto the individual to navigate a situation that more often than not is very much out of their control, even when we are using our tools, strategies, and existing capacity to try to communicate and figure out a way in which we can de-escalate the situation. We're often not being heard, we're often not being understood. And so that creates that escalation rather than that de-escalation so that we can minimize the impact that it may have on, all people involved, because the levels of distress are really, really impactful. And I think it's that piece there. How can we understand it? How can we meet these needs in order to de-escalate the situation and find the solution? And we often see the opposite happen, unfortunately. And I'm sorry to hear you've gone through that, and I'm even sorrier to say that that's not the first time. I sit on a lot of advocacy support cases where I hear things like this happen a lot of the time. And I think if we'd have paused at here, perhaps there, and a few other occasions, we might never have had that really explosive outcome
Yeah.
or experience. We may have been able to address this differently and really make sure that we figured out a way in which it works for everybody involved, because that is possible, right? It's not a case of kind of continuing this sense of otherness or minimizing, communities that have already struggled and suffered. There is absolutely a way in which we can all collaborate to create a cohesive space in which everybody can have their needs met. That is possible.
Yeah. And it's often, I feel like there's so much, it goes back to the employer versus employee
Mhm.
thing. It's just the the blame or the responsibility solely lies on the employee. Let me rephrase that, the neurodivergent individual. And it's like, yes, we do have to take responsibility. Yes, so we do have to whatever else there is to do. But also, it's a two-way thing. If somebody's making the effort to communicate, and communication is already hard for somebody with neurodivergence, and then putting on like, we're not listening to you, we're not doing that. And it's especially like from like discussions or work that I've done like outside, like with local authorities or children, children and young people. What I noticed is they're like, well, we did try, nobody listened, and then half an hour later, or like even within minutes, this happened. And it's like, and then especially when it's like hospital settings or like outside in the community, it's like, okay, so what happened? And you hear this and you see similarities, but like, it could have stopped there, it could have stopped there. And I feel like, especially a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people with neurodivergence may have carers, where it doesn't have to be like paid carers, as in like, people employed by local authorities or families or primary caregivers. It could be, you know, they're like families or partners or whoever it may be, and they get hurt. And then like it's like, okay, we're gonna press charges, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. And it's often and it's like this person is gonna end up in the criminal justice system. And they're probably going to have a few crises inside of there, quite a few probably. And it's gonna be like, okay, have you heard of police officer? And I feel like it's often like I feel like with professionals, it's often a different standard that people are held up to. Am I waffling? It feels like I'm waffling. Sorry.
And one of the things I love about my job and working exclusively with neurodivergent people is that this type of conversation makes sense to me. I need the tangents for the context, right? Give me a non-linear conversation any day of the week. I'm there for it. So I completely am following everything they're saying. And I think you're drawing, from different spaces to really connect a much wider conversation about that level of advocacy and autonomy in a neurodivergent individual, and some of the various ways in which we are continued to be negatively impacted by the ways in which society have these very stigmatized views and perceptions of, let's say, carers, additional supports, communication styles and differences and things like this.
Yeah, and it's like, and professionals are held to a very much like a very different standard, and they become this like protected class of people. And I'm like, this young person's done everything in their capacity to be able to. And it's like saying, if a baby's crying, be like, okay, I know you're 8 months old, but like go feed yourself. If you're hungry, go do something about it. It's not within a baby's capacity to be able to, I don't know, make self formula or do whatever, so why would you expect somebody with a different set of capacity to be able to do something that's outside of their capacity?
And
And I feel like respect is not a two-way thing most of the time when it comes with professionals. And I'm like, it's both ways, and you can't just expect it. And if you treat a person with respect, it goes like it does so well, and it helps both parties.
yeah,
And you can't be expected to be treated with respect when respect is not given to the individual, the other
absolutely.
party.
And I think, again, that extends to, all domains that we might find ourselves in at various points of life. It's not just the professionals that we are
Mm.
trusting to be able to, support us in our various areas that we might need supporting in. It's also in our, our leadership and management. It's also in, sort of our wider communities and how we will engage with different roles within it. We absolutely need to earn that level of respect through validating, seeing, hearing, and understanding people before we can then really see that play out. We can't, sort of ball into these spaces and absolutely demand something that, by its very design and definition, can only be earned.
Like going back to the main topic of sensory overload, beyond like traditional sensory like tools like noise cancelling headphones, what are some innovative technologies or approaches being explored to mitigate sensory overload?
That's a really good question. One thing I've seen that's really quite fascinating that seems to work quite well, are some of the quite innovative sort of healthcare apps that build in sort of check-ins, affirmations, self-care, and really interesting parts like this into a person's daily management. Because what we can sometimes see as a result is the reduction in those moments of sensory overload, because we are proactively and not always, sort of really consciously, putting measures in place to be able to navigate and manage ourselves. So when it comes to thinking about that in particular relevance to the sensory overload, if we are putting things in place to practice self-care and to practice self-regulation and even co-regulation when it's appropriate to do so, because that's okay too, we can start to see a much more effective management of, our needs and our challenges and our strengths. And by working in a much more strengths aligned capacity, putting those supports in place for those things that we might find challenging, that we've used a level of curiosity to become aware of, we can start to see a much less intense, kind of detrimental impact of that sensory overload. So I'd say there's quite a few interesting apps, in that way, that have started to come about. Other things that I've worked on with clients in the past that have been quite helpful include things like, communication and sensory passports. So again, producing a resource that helps us to understand the various elements of someone's sensory profile or experience, so that we can start to again proactively put measures in place to reduce any of the potential, sort of negative impact of that becoming a challenge, has been quite effective for people. Um, and again, it's always to do with the individual and what experience works well for them and what support measures work best for them as well. So For instance, I have worked on regulation toolkits, which are always really, really interesting and unique every time. They range from sort of things like crystals to certain smells to particular textures that people can start to build into a little toolkit, whether that is a metaphorical one or indeed a tangible one, or indeed a combination of both. Something that people can bring with them and take into all of their spaces so that they can navigate things that they might find particularly challenging that will trigger the sensory overload. So again, thinking in advance of what those potential triggers might be and what would therefore be helpful to navigate that. So again, a couple of personal examples that I'm happy to share to kind of contextualize this include for me, sounds and smells are very, very intense senses for me. So if I'm going into, let's say, a very busy public space that I can't necessarily guarantee I'm going to be able to control, because of course there might be, lots of, I don't know, crowds or things happening around me that I can't necessarily navigate particularly well, I will have a sensory friendly playlist of songs that I find very comforting and settling that I have downloaded so I can access it at any time, regardless of whether or not I've got signal. I've got that with obviously earphones that I can use if I need to, or if I want to stay engaged in a conversation, I can use loop earplugs instead, which again helps to reduce perhaps the impact of certain sounds, but allows me to perhaps engage a little bit more effectively in a conversation if I can't get away immediately from the busyness of that space. In terms of the smells, I have a couple of different essential oils that I find very, very comforting that I like a lot. And again, I will take those with me so that if I'm in a space where there's a particularly overpowering smell, such as someone's half a bottle of aftershave that they may have decided to put on and then
Oh
sit in
my God.
with. And that is, a very intense, overpowering experience for me. I've got something that I find very comforting, very settling, so that I can use that in that moment to help me navigate the otherwise overpowering experience.
Another question. Why do you, I feel like people, it's like perfume. Perfume is very concentrated. It's like there's like eau de toilette or something like that, which is much more weaker, which I understand if you like spritz a bit more. But like aftershave and perfume, it's I and it's like you can tell they're coming from Australia. Like it's so intense.
Yeah,
Like
certainly
I
can
don't
be.
need to know what's happening in Australia and who's wearing aftershave.
Mhm.
Like just a little drops will do. It's like
Absolutely.
all cigarettes. That's another thing. Mm, yeah, no. Um, yeah, I learned not recently. I keep learning because I keep forgetting. Asking people if they smoke cigarettes or being like, "You smell like cigarettes." That's what I do. You smell like cigarettes. Apparently, that's not socially acceptable. Learning. I keep forgetting, but I'm like, it's a very intense. Like,
So in that situation, we can see how a particular smell has been, potentially very overpowering and intense, understandably in that moment, trigger that response where we're then not able to access our executive functions in that moment, which include impulse control, i.e., that filter. And in that moment, we might say something without thinking, oh, that may or may not have been something I could ask that person in that moment. And again, even me saying that, I'm saying that from almost a neurotypical's expectation and, applying this expectation that we must have certain parameters around conversations that make it acceptable and not acceptable.
yeah, definitely. And I feel like impulse control, it's like even like sensory like aspects can bring like can exacerbate like impulse control. And yeah, like in your line of work, what have you noticed are some of the misconceptions about sensory overload?
Mm, that's a good question. And I would perhaps say one of the biggest misconceptions that I've seen is this expectation that we should just be able to tolerate anything and everything without any context or understanding or compassion, just that, oh, well, that's part of life and you should just get on with it. I think that can be really harmful because it not only really invalidates someone's very important, valid experience, it also completely cuts off any opportunity for, that sort of mutual collaboration and understanding to take place, which will then enable people to figure out how to navigate that situation in a way that works for us. So it's that expectation that when you hit a certain age, which often in our society is 18, i.e., you're an adult now, we should just be able to handle these things. Oh, the, overhead fluorescent lights give you headaches. Well, just take a paracetamol. Oh, you find that smell to be particularly overpowering, just, walk away to another carriage. It's this really harmful perception that we should just be able to tolerate it. It should not be an issue. And if it is, we should find ways in which to get over it, essentially. And I've purposefully used the word should there, because that speaks to the sort of very ableist narrative that is often underpinning these misconceptions and very unfair expectations.
Definitely. I feel like there's so much expectations and so much, and the people don't understand the weight of those expectations. And especially I feel like the younger you are, I feel like it's an issue where you take everything like, "Oh, I should have said that. I don't know why I shouldn't have said that, but I was told off for it." But it's like, what's wrong with it? I don't understand. Or when people are laughing at something you're saying because you're just brutally honest, and you don't understand that you're being brutally honest, and you don't understand where the laughter is coming from. You're like, maybe I shouldn't say that. Why are they laughing? Is it something I said? Is it wrong? Why is everybody laughing? What am I not understanding? And it's like a whole spiral. And I feel like as the older I'm getting, I'm like, fuck this shit. That seemed like a them problem. I would do me and they could do them. And we'll see where that goes. But I feel like especially, I've also noticed, I don't know if this little pat sensory overload, I've noticed in females, sensory overload, it becomes more obvious the older you get. It's like from adolescent ages or like older, isn't it? Especially in adolescence ages.
I would definitely say this is one of the reasons I so passionately wish we had more access to research and understanding, because my brain wants to propose that there's quite probably a link there between the fluctuations in our hormones and the various stages throughout our lifespan that we go through having a major impact on things like our sensory experience. I think as well, just taking a note to say that there is a fluctuating nature to this. Hormones irrespective, they are a big factor. But when we think about someone's sensory profile in general, there will be things that will affect the intensity of these at any given moment. And I think that is an area that I would love to see, a better understanding in, more research in, more support in, because I think, yes, absolutely, there are different stages at which things impact us differently, and really understanding what some of those contributing factors could be, I think is really crucial if we are to work towards a more inclusive society.
Definitely. I feel like, in terms of research, I think only like 10 years ago or something like that was there like research done on a female, something, I think it was autism, how I think it's autism research, and then there were some females included as participants. But I feel like even though I feel like I want this research to happen like in the next like to be finished by the next 10 to 15 years. But no, being realistic, like I feel like when I'm retiring, it might come out. Like
Yes.
it's like I'm like people don't understand the value of it. And then they're gonna it's like for example, like when I was in the psychiatric ward as a child, there's no more than two boys in the ward, and that's rare. Like two boys is like a lot of boys, and in the psychiatric ward, like two boys. It's like, ooh. When a boy comes onto the psychiatric ward, it's like, ooh, because it's like there's something. This is the point that I should have made. Everybody, I don't know about adult psychiatric ward, never been, hopefully never will. What I notice is that they, everybody there, most people there, I'm gonna say most people there, have both autism and ADHD. And if you don't, I'm actually like all of them. From my experience, all of them, every single stay that I had, or like 5 times, everybody had autism and ADHD. And if you didn't have both, it was a bit strange. Or if you didn't have, it's like, and there is a link, there is a link to mental health and neurodivergence. And people are going to wonder, oh my God, why are there so many people like who are neurodivergent in psychiatric ward? Why are there so many people who are in like prison and they're like neurodivergent or whatever it may be? And you're like, hmm. Well, if we had the research, then we could have been like, this is why. Or we can use the already limited research that's out there to explain what is what's like. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I feel like people need to start doing more. And there needs to be, I feel like, a special pot of funding just focus on female neurodivergence. It's about time.
That'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Great. You know, £1 million or so. I feel like £1 million is just great to start with. You know,
It would be a good start. I would almost be inclined to say that it would probably barely scrape the tip of the iceberg in terms of
I
where we need to get to, but it would at least be a great start for sure.
definitely. I said £1 million because I'm like, these people are not gonna, well, they're gonna barely give us like £10. It's a bit of a stretch. Like I was like, and I feel like a lot of people on the board of research panels or like research funders, I don't know what they're called, but give funding. They're like usually like white old men.
Mhm.
So why would they see the priority and the need those for those sort of research?
I think you've just hit on a really crucial point there about that diversity being present in all areas, really driving that sense of fairness and balance for everything. You know, we're not just talking about research at this point, we're talking about all areas in which a very, very small, specific, limited representation has a major, major impact on the value of certain things that are brought to the discussions. And I think that is, you know, true of all areas that we could potentially explore, particularly when it comes to neurodivergence. I mean, you know, the DSM criteria is incredibly reductive and based on a small control group of young white boys. And so, of course, by its very nature, does not include the incredible variations in an experience of neurodivergence if you are anything other than a young white boy, essentially. And I think that diversity piece is another crucial, crucial, hugely underrepresented area when we're exploring things like this.
Definitely. And I feel like it's even like that, like I feel like, for example, like I feel like this is a very common experience. You know, that like hyperactive black boy in your class is seen as like, oh, he's misbehaving. He's, you know, he's just loud and he's aggressive and he's whatever. He probably has ADHD. He probably, but you know, because it's based on a certain demographic, nobody's going to see that. And even if you had a black, Asian, or minority ethnic teacher, those biases and those opinions are going to be passed on from teacher to teacher to teacher.
Mhm.
So it doesn't make a difference whether you have, like, you know, a minority ethnic teacher or not,
Absolutely.
because biases are like so, they're like, they're like, they're like so contagious. Like, you know, it spreads so quickly. and it sticks with you, and to erase that bias, that's going to take another few years.
Takes not just a period of time, it also takes, uncomfortable spaces to really address it, unpack it, relearn a different way. We're talking about systematic change on a huge, huge scale here. We're talking about the diversity, or rather the lack of diversity and inclusion in policies, in procedures, in workplace culture, in environments, in leadership, in management, in everything. So absolutely, yes, it's going to take some time. Does not mean that we should not do it. It's
Yeah.
really vital that we're doing it in order to work towards a more inclusive culture.
And I feel like it starts from management down. And then people are like, oh, well, this, like it's not necessarily just to do with education, but like anywhere. It doesn't, and people are like, somebody has to set the example, even if people on the floor are doing it, doesn't mean it's going to be a department through practice. It needs to, if managers don't like set the standard is not going to be kept. The standard is not going to be there. And it's like come back to that neurodiversity awareness training and whatever. Like, why is it taking this long? Why is it? It's like even like that bill for education, neurodiversity training in education was just passed like less than a month ago, maybe 2 months ago at most. And I'm
Oh,
like, yeah, how much longer are we going to wait until it's like through healthcare or like much more? Neurodiversity training is great. It's great and everything, but it's like no more than like a day or 2 days long.
mhm.
And how often are you doing this training? And how advanced does it get? And how it's just so many. It's like baby steps are great, but they need to start doing some sorts. I don't know what, but yeah.
Absolutely, completely agree.
What are the psychological impacts, do you think, of chronic sensory overload on mental health? And with ADHD coaching, how can that help mitigate these effects? I know like ADHD coaching is not necessarily to do with mental health, and it's not sort of like mental health intervention, but it must go hand in hand some way.
Yeah, absolutely. As with many, many things, there's always a level of overlap, and there's a lot to unpack here. So I may have to ask for you to remind me of the second part to that question. But to speak firstly on these sort of potentials, I think was it the physiological risks of chronic sensory overload?
Yeah.
Major, major, major. I mean, from an employment point of view, we're looking at potentially higher rates of absenteeism, longer periods of long-term sickness, issues with phased return to work, if at all possible, leading into all sorts of sort of challenging cases around grievances, and at the very worst, I've seen it, potentially employment tribunals. We've got devastating consequences on our actual sort of, internal systems, because we are not designed to be able to sustain things like adrenaline and cortisol in our body for, extended periods of time. And what we can see and understand about chronic sensory overload is that it, of course, triggers those, sort of stress responses and those survival mechanisms that are deep within us, which in turn, of course, trigger the adrenaline, cortisol, the other things going through our systems that we need in those states. And the consequences for us experiencing that in a very chronic and long-term capacity are dire. We're looking at really, concerning long-term health issues. We're looking at things that absolutely could, at best, have been completely avoided, and, potentially as a medium B, at least far, far reduced in terms of their impact. But they could be exponential in terms of the negative implications it can have. So it's not just that long-term sickness, but it's also the potential creation and or exacerbation of other mental health difficulties like anxiety, depression, other things such as disordered eating, for instance. I know that was something that I had a personal journey with throughout very many years of not realizing that I was in a state of permanent dysregulation and sensory overload. So I would seek other ways in which I could try to control my environment and my own internal chaos, so to speak, at the time, which very much looked like developing other what would turn out to be destructive ways in which I could manage that. So we're looking not just at autoimmune disorders, we're also looking at long-term chronic health conditions, other, as I say, associated difficulties and challenges to navigate. It's endless. Quite frankly, it's endless. Insomnia as well is another thing that I see a lot of the time. So yeah, it's quite concerning when we look at it, especially if we look at this from sort of a healthcare management point of view. And something I'm, constantly frustrated with is this firefighting habit that our sort of culture is very much built upon. It's, oh, there's a fire over there. Yeah, well, it's not actually that bad though, is it? We'll just wait for it to be a full-blown forest fire before we might do something about it. And
Yeah.
all the time, I'm thinking, if we put it out now, we wouldn't have had to have suffered an entire forest's worth of damage. And the same can be said for a person's health. If we put the correct and appropriate supports in place for that individual to navigate things like chronic sensory overload, they would not then be suffering with, potential insomnia, autoimmune differences, eating disorders, OCD, you name it, it could potentially be there as a result of not having had that support. So, yeah, I would say that it's devastating. And of course, because I got quite passionate about that, I've forgotten the second part of the question. So, could you repeat it?
Okay, don't worry about it. How does ADHD coaching help mitigate these effects?
Right, gotcha. So, I think I mentioned it briefly earlier when I said about that real elemental initial part that a lot of people often overlook and miss out on is that level of curiosity and understanding in the beginning. So a coach can help you to create a safe space in which you can understand and unpack what this actually means for you as an individual. And as a result of that, how then to figure out the strategies, supports, tools, whatever it is you need to be able to mitigate the potential impacts and effects of this. So that can look like helping someone to develop their understanding of their own personal sensory profile and building in non-negotiables and routine elements of their sort of structures and days, which specifically, sort of counteract some of the potential elements of sensory overload. So an example of what that might look like real time is helping someone to build in non-negotiables in their, sort of daily demands and routines, which help them to balance the energy expenditure that they'll be looking at investing and having come out of themselves, as it were. So getting people to really recognize that and understand what that looks like on an individual level can be really empowering, because then it helps you to build a much more inclusive lifestyle in accordance with your capacity and your strengths, so as to mitigate some of those potential impacts of sensory overload. So that can look like having, I don't know, let's say some set decompression time every time you leave the house and go to a particularly challenging, different environment that may trigger some of those sensory overload challenges. That could look like making sure you have a sensory toolkit before you leave the house to help you navigate any of those particular things that you might find challenging. But ultimately, it is about that real level of understanding, curiosity, and empowerment to the individual experience before anything else.
And like not with everybody with autism. I mean, not autism, not everybody with neurodivergence has this, but with sensory like difficulties and whether it's processing or being overwhelmed with sensory overload, comes rituals and routines.
Mhm.
How do um how do rituals and routines specifically benefit neurodivergent individuals in terms of stability and anxiety reduction? Also, like routines and rituals, they have this um like perception that they are intense and they're very unhealthy.
Mm.
Can you like explain how they can be like healthy as
Hmm.
well? And it's not just a very intense form that's always
Absolutely.
like prescribed.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot here. So I think in terms of the sort of potential ways in which people can perceive this area as being unhealthy, I think that again speaks to the potential misconceptions and ableist views that someone might be either consciously or unconsciously applying to that particular area, in terms of then understanding the role of, rituals and routines and what this can look like for each and every one of us. I think it's really important to recognize that building effective routines for us, and as you say, in particular, neurodivergent people, can help to create a sense of security that we can really anchor ourselves to, which in turn will help to reduce those potentially really distressing, triggers of anxiety and things like that, triggers that will exacerbate our experience of anxiety, rather. So I think here it's really important to understand that aspect of it and that it can create that level of security. So there's a phrase, I can't remember off the top of my head who said it, but I will find out and get you to pop it in the show notes. But there's a phrase that really stuck with me, and I think it's quite relative here, and that is our nervous system will always choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. And my interpretation of that is that we may very well understand that something could be potentially destructive or unhealthy to us, but if it's familiar, then we will have a natural tendency to be drawn towards that familiarity rather than that uncertainty of something that we may be able to rationalize is healthier or safer for us. That because it feels unfamiliar, it therefore feels less trustworthy, less safe, less secure. So we're not going to go with that. So I think
Jackie Jones.
it might well have been. Again, I will defo have to double check, but I think if you've already researched it, then there we go. But I think that's really, really poignant because understanding that aspect can help us to, again, practice that self-compassion, that self-acceptance to go, oh, okay, so I can stop beating myself up over this pattern that I've created, which I recognize may not be the best for me, but still it feels like something I need or want in my life. So offering that level of understanding can help to create that sense of self-compassion, self-forgiveness, and then that curiosity of, okay, well, how could things be differently then? And what would I like for that to include? And how can I build in that level of trust and security into a routine that I can have for myself to navigate whatever potential, sort of process that I'm looking for this ritual to support me with. And building that into how people manage certain challenges, I think is really crucial for, the sort of long lasting, successful management of something. So I know when we were having a chat about this, we sort of mentioned examples of this to include things like, bedtime rituals and things like that. So when we think about those specific examples, building in a routine can help us to feel more stable and secure, feel that we can predict the potential outcome of it that bit better, and therefore, again, feel much calmer as a result because we feel a lot more anchored to that familiarity of it. We can see that reduction in overwhelm that we might get from feeling very sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of well, I guess overwhelmed from choice, for instance. So, as an example, I have to have my meals planned in advance because I can cook, I can eat, I can plan. I cannot do all of those things at once. I cannot just go to a fridge, look at the stuff there and be like, well, I have these ingredients. I fancy that. I'll make this. That is too much for me in a very short space of time, often when I'm hungry and therefore needing to do it quickly, right? So the way in which I will navigate that is to plan in advance with a level of flexibility because, there's every chance I might get to that particular meal I've planned and gone, oh, I don't fancy that right now. In which case, fine, I've got the flexibility there. But having that plan reduces that overwhelm in the moment of having to make all of those decisions in really quick succession and then tap into what may already be my maxed out executive functioning capacity for the day to go through the process of cooking said meal. So that's how we can see an example of, sort of routines and planning become really effective for managing those potential moments of overwhelm and overstimulation. And it means that I actually eat 3 meals a day instead of, forgetting to eat, which is something that I would permanently do, sort of pre-awareness of being neurodivergent. So
Definitely. I feel like it's I don't know if you do this, but if you're cooking or you're planning or whatever it may be, I feel like I do this with everything. But it's like I'm gonna do this in like a week. And every day I'm reminding myself, I'm gonna do this on this day. I'm gonna do this day multiple times every single day on the lead up, being like, yeah, I'm gonna get overwhelmed now. Starting to get overwhelmed then. And I feel like always like you just end up doing half a task. Maybe either a bit less than half or a bit more than half. But like yeah, this is fun and everything. Yeah, but this part seems like somebody else's job. Like I like cooking, but when it comes to waiting or like I now have to stop what I was doing because it's all finished, then get back into it later.
yeah, that's a challenge, right? I struggle with that one too. Yeah, huge.
It's
So
like,
again, I will think about ways in which I can kind of maybe reduce that waiting time by the ways in which I'll cook. Because if I look at something and think, oh, I've got to do that, I've got to switch tasks, I've got to come away from it, I've got to come back to it, I've got to reinitiate that task. Nah, I'm not going to do that. I will then search, bless you, for the ways in which I can maybe reduce that. And that sometimes looks like cooking the meal from one pan all in one go so that I can, sort of prep, cook, eat, job done. Or it can sometimes look a lot of the time like bulk cooking. So I
oh
have the
yes.
once a day. It is not going to happen 3 times, not fresh. So I will cook enough of a meal in the evening to then be able to have it the next day as a lunch, because then I know I only have to make decisions about food once a day. And that is plenty for me. So that's how I'll do it. Because otherwise, it's a lot of, coming to the task, coming back from the task. That, yeah, I totally get it.
I I have a question. Do you have that feeling of like do you like do you cook like wait, question, do you cook like multiple times a day?
No, that's what I'm saying. Like, I would not be able to sort of do, I would not, yeah, no.
Yeah, okay. I was like, here, let me just check, like double check.
Mm.
Because I was about to like give you like an MBE or something. I was
I was
like,
ready to take it.
I was like, it's so difficult. I'm like the waiting times, I'm like, as soon as I sit down, I know that's the end of it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
Now, like I have one safe meal for breakfast that I will have until it's not a safe meal, and then I will have to find a new one. And that's always very distressing because, I love having my meals that I know I'm going to eat because then I don't have to think about what I'm going to eat. So I will have the same thing in the morning, then I will have the leftovers for lunch, and then obviously the only time I'll actually be then cooking fresh would be the dinner. And even then, and I will always speak from my lived experience to really validate this. I don't have the capacity to cook every day. So I have to lean into support and ask for help to co-regulate and manage that challenge. Because if I were to cook 7 days of the week, I would by the end of it quite possibly not have the capacity to do other things that are really important to me as well. And that's where, sort of working in a partnership can be really, really useful for me. So yeah, my partner is brilliant and is really, really helpful. So we will in advance plan the days and we'll take it in turns to sort of prepare and cook food, which is really helpful for me.
yeah, I have that support network and it's called like Just Eat, Uber Eats, and whatever else there is. Maybe Deliveroo. It's
Nice,
like
nice, absolutely. I feel like I would probably have much better access to that if I lived in a city-based area. Alas, I'm
oh,
in a rural area, so I don't have as much access to that.
I feel like if I ever like I hear this like often, like when I'm like filming podcasts, or it's like people from like different countries, and I'm like, I'd be like, I will like reevaluate my whole movie thing. Like I'm like the sort of person be like, this is my support network. This is the only thing I have for me. Any job, higher pay? Yeah, no, it's fine. I am.
But you're hitting on a really important point there, thinking about your support network, particularly around big decisions that might require a transition. Because if you don't have your support networks or you can't transfer them as easily, there's
Yeah.
definitely space to explore and ensure that you've got that before you then go and make any bold decisions or any sort of big, sort of significantly life-changing decisions.
And you know what? Like employers respect that even more as well. It's like I had to turn down this job because I was like mentally not in a good place. And then a few months later, I was like, I never do this. I was like, let me be spontaneous. I haven't had my ADHD medication. Like, and I was like, yeah, let me ask if this job is still available or if it's not there. And like, do something. And yeah, it went well. Like,
And
I got it back. And I was like, it's like, and I feel like it's that people, like employers, love people who can, you know when they're burning out or when they, need to put something on pause and then come back to it. And I think as an employer myself, I know that I prefer somebody asking me for like 2 weeks off and and you know and that's fine because you do you. You're gonna come back, you're gonna work better or what. But I
mm,
feel like there's this guy on TikTok and he talks about toxic employers. Uh, there was some sort of point that I was going to say with that. I don't know. Now this sounds stupid. Uh, and yeah, and like going away for a few days, absolutely fine. And people have such a problem with it. And then when people quit, and they're like, "Oh, can you come back? Go cry to your mommy about it." Like it's
yeah,
like I feel like people don't understand the way that you treat staff will definitely your staff will definitely reward you or not reward you.
I think this is a pivotal piece, and it's something I'm really passionate about in my organizational work that I do. And that is seeing your employees as an investment rather than an expense.
Definitely.
And the mindset shift that can come from seeing that and believing it is absolutely exponential because if you have a business that requires a workforce in order to run it, then your business will absolutely, well, your business success or indeed failings will be directly relative to the way in which that workforce is, treated, cared for, supported, handled. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are making the business happen. So if they're not having their needs met both inside and outside of work, then naturally their capacity to perform to the best of their ability will be impacted. So anything that an employer can do to support those needs, help to remove any obstacles and barriers, will absolutely have a direct positive impact on the profitability, scalability, and productivity of your business.
Definitely. There's some like volunteers that I have, and people think there's another thing. People think volunteers are full-time employees. They're not.
No.
And um some of my volunteers, you know, they there's like if you work 8 hours is great. We use like 8 hours. It's not like a requirement, but if they do it, it's great. And because you treat them so well, some people work like 18-hour day, not 18-hour days, 18-hour weeks because they're happy about the mission. They're really optimistic and enthusiastic, and you treat them well. And it's like I don't think people understand how rewarding it could be if you, not just for you as someone who runs a team, but also for your own organization.
Absolutely.